For most of human history, the idea of a single romantic partner chosen for life was not the organising principle of human social existence. It is a strange thought to sit with, especially in a world where the language of love, commitment and belonging has been so thoroughly shaped by centuries of one particular tradition. And yet, if we look carefully at the long arc of our species, at the hundreds of thousands of years before agriculture, before cities, before written law and religious doctrine, what we find is something far more fluid, far more varied, and in many ways far more human than the rigid categories we have inherited. This raises a quiet question that is worth following slowly into the night. How did human beings actually form their closest bonds across the vast majority of our existence? What did love, kinship and belonging look like before anyone had a word for marriage? The answer, it turns out, does not fit neatly into any single modern framework. It does not confirm the fantasies of any particular ideology. It does not tell us that ancient humans were libertines without attachment, nor does it tell us they were secretly practicing the family structures of a Victorian novel. What it tells us instead is that human social life has always been enormously complex, enormously varied, and always shaped by the pressures of survival, the geography of the land, the availability of food, and the deep biological architecture of a species that evolved not in isolation, but in groups. To understand that complexity, we have to begin not with romance, but with something more fundamental. We have to begin with the question of what a human group actually was in the deep past. Because the social unit is the beginning of everything. Before there was a couple, there was a band. Before there was a family, there was a community. And the shape of intimate relationships within that community was always, in some sense, downstream of the shape of the community itself. Anthropologists who study hunter-gatherer societies, both those that existed in the deep past and the small number that persisted into the modern era, have consistently described a basic social unit known as the band. A band was typically a group of somewhere between 20 and 50 individuals, though this number fluctuated considerably depending on the season and the availability of resources. These people were not simply a collection of nuclear families living in proximity. They were bound together by kinship, by cooperation, by shared territory, by the kind of intimate daily knowledge of one another that comes from spending every waking and sleeping hour in close physical contact. Such a group, the boundaries between households, to the extent that such a concept even existed, were highly permeable. Children were fed and cared for not only by their biological parents, but by the broader group. Elderly members were supported by younger ones who were not necessarily their own descendants. The labour of gathering, hunting, cooking, and childcare was distributed across the group in patterns that shifted with need, season, and circumstance. In this context, the question of who was bonded to whom, and in what way, was answered not by a ceremony or a contract, but by the ongoing texture of daily life. From an evolutionary perspective, this makes a great deal of sense. The human infant is among the most helpless creatures in the animal kingdom. A newborn human requires years of intensive care before it can begin to contribute meaningfully to its own survival. This is not a minor biological fact. It is the central organising challenge of human social life. The mother of a young child in a hunter-gatherer environment faced an enormous practical problem. She needed to gather food, to carry the child, to sleep, to recover from childbirth, and to do all of this while remaining mobile enough to follow the group's movements across a landscape. No single partner, however devoted, could solve all of these problems alone. The group was the solution. This is what evolutionary anthropologists sometimes call cooperative breeding. Unlike most primates, humans appear to have evolved within a social system in which the rearing of children was shared broadly across the group. Grandmothers, aunts, older siblings, and unrelated band members all contributed to the care of young children. This is not a peripheral feature of human social evolution. Many researchers believe it is among the most central. The expansion of the human brain, which requires such an extended period of development and nurturing, may have been made possible precisely because our ancestors did not raise children in isolation. What this means for the question of intimate relationships is significant. In a world where the care of children is distributed across the group, the biological paternity of a child, while not irrelevant, is not the single most important social fact about that child's life. What matters more is the web of relationships that surrounds the child, who feeds it, who carries it, who teaches it, who protects it. And those relationships do not map neatly onto any single model of pair bonding or family structure. If we look deeper into the archaeological and anthropological record, we begin to see the outlines of this complexity in striking detail. The San people of southern Africa, who've lived as hunter-gatherers for an extraordinarily long period of time, have been studied extensively by anthropologists seeking to understand the social structures of our distant ancestors. Among the San, marriage exists as a recognized social institution, but it takes a form quite different from what most people in industrialized societies would recognize. Marriages are often arranged between families as a way of creating alliances and managing the flow of resources and obligations across the group. But within those marriages, the degree of flexibility and fluidity is considerable. Among many San groups, divorce, or something functionally equivalent to it, is relatively easy to accomplish. A person who is unhappy in a partnership may simply leave, and the social consequences are manageable rather than catastrophic, in large part because the broad group continues to provide support for all of its members regardless of their marital status. Children remain embedded in the extended network of the band even when their parents' relationship dissolves. The social safety net does not depend on any particular pair bond remaining intact. This pattern, in which marriage or partnership exists but is held somewhat lightly, embedded within a larger web of communal obligation, is not unique to the San. It has been documented in various forms in hunter-gatherer societies on nearly every inhabited continent. Among the Hadza of Tanzania, who are thought to be among the last true hunter-gatherers in Africa, and whose lifestyle have been intensively studied in recent decades, similar patterns emerge. The Hadza live in small, highly fluid camps that form and dissolve with remarkable speed. People move between camps frequently, and the composition of any given camp may change substantially over the course of a single season. In this social environment, long-term monogamous pair bonds exist alongside other arrangements, and the definition of family is broad and flexible enough to accommodate considerable variation. In the Amazon basin, anthropologists have documented societies in which a concept known as partible paternity is culturally recognized. This is the belief, held sincerely and encoded in the practical social structure of the group, that a child can have more than one biological father. The idea is that a coitus is built up gradually from the contributions of multiple men, and that therefore a child whose mother had more than one partner during a pregnancy has more than one father. All of these men are understood to have real obligations toward the child, and the child benefits from having multiple fathers who contribute food, protection, and care. From a strictly biological standpoint, this belief is of course incorrect, but its social consequences are remarkable. In societies that practice partible paternity, children tend to have access to resources from multiple households. They have multiple adults who feel a recognized obligation to care for them. Studies of groups in South America where this belief is common have found that children with multiple recognized fathers tend to have improved nutritional outcomes compared to children with only a single recognized father. Whatever the belief's relationship to biological reality, it generates a social structure that works, that distributes the obligations of childcare broadly, and thereby increases the resilience of children and their mothers. This is not an argument for or against any particular belief system or family structure. It is an observation about the diversity of human solutions to the universal problem of how to care for children in a world where survival is uncertain and resources are scarce. Humans have solved this problem in an enormous variety of ways. Some of those solutions look recognizable to modern eyes. Others look strange and even unsettling. But all of them emerge from the same basic human reality, the same evolutionary pressures, the same deep need for connection and cooperation. Just to understand this further, it helps to think carefully about the timeline of human history. Our species, Homo sapiens, has existed for something in the range of 300,000 years. Agriculture, the technology that fundamentally transformed human social organization, emerged only about 10,000 years ago. Writing emerged only about 5,000 years ago. The legal and religious frameworks that most people today associate with the concept of marriage have been in place in their current forms for far less time than that. Even the specific form of monogamous marriage that dominates in most contemporary societies, the idea of a single legally recognized partner chosen freely by both individuals based primarily on romantic love, is a remarkably recent cultural invention. For the vast majority of our species' existence, for roughly 90% of all the time that Homo sapiens has walked the earth, humans lived in ways that modern legal and religious frameworks would not recognize or would actively prohibit. This is not a criticism of those frameworks. It is simply a historical fact. The forms that human relationships took for most of our history were shaped by the realities of a world that no longer exists. A world of small bands, of shared resources, of constant movement, of high infant mortality and uncertain food supply. Understanding those forms helps us understand our species. It helps us understand why human beings feel the things they feel about love and connection and belonging. It helps us understand why we are so complicated. If we look at the earliest genetic evidence, we find additional layers of complexity. Geneticists who study ancient DNA, the DNA recovered from the bones of our distant ancestors, buried in caves and rock shelters across Europe, Africa, and Asia, have made a series of striking discoveries over the past 2 decades. One of the most illuminating of these concerns the patterns of genetic relatedness within ancient burial sites. When researchers analysed the DNA of individuals buried together in what appeared to be family groupings at sites dating to the period before agriculture, they often found patterns of kinship that did not match the predictions of a simple nuclear family model. In some sites, the individuals buried together showed patterns of relatedness suggesting that residence after partnership was organised not around the couple, but around one of the extended kin groups. In other sites, the genetic signatures were more complex still, showing patterns that suggested people were moving between groups across considerable distances, forming bonds and producing children in ways that spread genes widely across the landscape. This genetic mixing was not a sign of social chaos, it was in fact a sign of social sophistication, of networks of obligation and alliance that stretched well beyond the boundaries of any single band. The deliberate maintenance of these genetic and social networks served crucial functions. A band that remained too genetically isolated risked the accumulation of harmful mutations. A band that maintained strong social ties with neighbouring groups could call upon those groups for help in times of crisis. When the rains failed, when the herds moved away, when illness swept through the camp. The relationships that facilitated this network maintenance were not only romantic or sexual, they were also relationships of kinship, alliance, trade, and mutual obligation. But they were often sealed and sustained by the creation of children who belonged, in some sense, to both groups. The question of what hunter-gatherer relationships felt like from the inside, what people experienced emotionally, what they wanted, what they grieved, what they celebrated, is one that the archaeological record cannot answer directly. But it's one that anthropologists have approached carefully and thoughtfully through the study of contemporary and recent hunter-gatherer societies, and through the application of evolutionary psychology to the question of human emotional architecture. What emerges from this inquiry is a picture of human emotional life that is recognisable and yet more spacious than many modern people expect. Human beings appear to have a deep capacity for long-term pair bonding, for the kind of sustained emotional and practical partnership with a particular individual that we call love. This capacity is real and ancient. It is encoded in our neurobiology. The hormones of attachment, oxytocin, vasopressin, and others, are ancient systems that we share with other pair bonding species. The experience of longing for a specific person, of feeling grief at their loss, of finding particular comfort in their presence. These are not cultural inventions, they are biological realities. But alongside this capacity for pair bonding, human beings also carry other emotional capacities that are equally ancient and equally real. The capacity for deep friendship and emotional intimacy with multiple people simultaneously. The capacity for what anthropologists sometimes call diffuse attachment, a warm sense of belonging and obligation that is spread across a whole community rather than concentrated in a single relationship. The capacity for the kind of love that exists between parents and children, between siblings, between people who have survived difficult times together and know each other with the thoroughness that only shared hardship can produce. In hunter-gatherer bands, all of these emotional capacities were routinely engaged. A person in such a group was not choosing between love for a partner and love for the community. They were embedded in a web of relationships that engaged many different kinds of love simultaneously. The partnership with a particular individual existed within, and was sustained by, the larger web. When the partnership faltered or changed, the web remained. This is, in many ways, a profoundly different emotional ecology from the one that most people in industrialized societies inhabit today. In contemporary life, the romantic partnership has become something very close to the sole legitimate vehicle for adult intimacy. The expectation that a single person will be one's primary emotional support, closest friend, co-parent, financial partner, intellectual companion, and source of romantic and physical connection is historically unusual and, many researchers argue, extraordinarily demanding. The rate at which contemporary partnerships fail, and the degree of pain that accompanies these failures may in part reflect the weight of expectation that modern culture has placed upon them. This is not to say that modern partnerships are worse than ancient ones, or that the diversity of ancient relationship forms was unambiguously good. The lives of hunter-gatherer women in particular were shaped by constraints and vulnerabilities that no modern person would want to inhabit. The relative ease of partnership to solution in some hunter-gatherer societies did not always benefit women, who typically remained more burdened by the care of young children regardless of the state of their partnerships. The broad distribution of childcare across the group helped to offset this burden, but it did not eliminate it. And it would be deeply misleading to paint a picture of hunter-gatherer social life as a kind of paradise of freely chosen, mutually satisfying connection. Hunter-gatherer communities were not utopias. They contained hierarchy and inequality, even if these were less extreme than what emerged after agriculture. They contained conflict and jealousy and grief. The emotional capacities that we bring to relationships, including the capacity for possessiveness, for resentment, for the particular pain of feeling that someone we love has chosen another, are as ancient as our capacity for attachment itself. These emotions were present in hunter-gatherer band just as they are present in every human community across history. What was different was not the emotional palette, but the social container within which those emotions were expressed and managed. In a band of 30 people who depend on each other for survival, the costs of unresolved interpersonal conflict are enormous. The mechanisms for managing conflict, for mediating between people, for distributing resources in ways that reduce resentment, for maintaining the social fabric even when individual relationships are under stress, were therefore elaborate and sophisticated. The ethnographic record is full of accounts of the care with which hunter-gatherer communities manage the social disruptions caused by jealousy, partnership dissolution, and competing desires. These were not simple or easy problems. They required real social intelligence and real collective effort to manage. If we look now at the transition from hunter-gatherer life to agricultural life, a transition that happened at different times in different parts of the world, beginning roughly 10,000 years ago, we see a dramatic transformation in the structure of human relationships. Agriculture created fixed settlements. It created the accumulation of property, land, animals, stored grain that could be passed from one generation to the next. And it created, for the first time in human history, a strong practical incentive to know with certainty which children were the biological offspring of which fathers. In a mobile hunter-gatherer band where property was minimal and resources were shared broadly, the question of biological paternity was socially manageable. But in an agricultural community where a man might own land and animals and wish to pass them to his children, the certainty of paternity became a matter of considerable practical importance. This shift in the economics of reproduction had profound consequences for the position of women and for the structure of human relationships. Across the world, societies became agricultural. There is a general pattern in the archaeological and historical record of increasing restriction on the sexual and social freedom of women. Practices emerged that were designed to ensure male certainty of paternity, practices that controlled where women could go, whom they could speak with, how they dressed, and what social roles they could occupy. These practices varied enormously in their specific forms across different cultures, but the underlying function was often similar: to create social conditions in which a man could be reasonably confident that the children born to his partner were his biological offspring. At the same time, the emergence of agriculture created new forms of social hierarchy that transformed the landscape of relationships in other ways. In hunter-gatherer bands, significant accumulations of status and wealth were difficult to maintain because the group's survival depended on broad sharing of resources. A hunter who killed a large animal could not simply keep it for himself. He was obligated by the norms of the group to distribute it. The social pressure towards sharing was strong enough to prevent any individual from accumulating resources dramatically disproportionate to those of his neighbours. Agriculture changed this. It became possible, for the first time, for some people to accumulate significantly more than others, and with that accumulation came new possibilities for the concentration of reproductive success. In many early agricultural and pastoral societies, the historical record shows patterns of extreme reproductive inequality, particularly among men. Genetic evidence suggests that in some periods of early Eurasian history, the ratio of reproducing women to reproducing men was dramatically skewed. Far more women are producing children who survived than men. This is the genetic signature of giant social structures combined with high levels of male-on-male competition, structures in which a relatively small number of men had access to multiple partners while many men had none. This is a painful and uncomfortable fact of human history. It reflects the capacity of hierarchical societies to concentrate reproductive access, just as they concentrate other forms of resource at the top of the social order. The harems of ancient kings, the concubine systems of classical civilizations, the multiple wives of pastoralist chiefs, these were not cultural curiosities. They were expressions of a social logic that had become possible only with the emergence of surplus and hierarchy, and they coexisted in complex ways with norms of monogamy for the majority of the population who lacked the resources to maintain multiple households. The relationship between social class and relation structure has been consistent across many periods and many societies. Those with more resources have historically had access to a wider range of social and intimate options. Those with fewer resources have been constrained by economic necessity into arrangements that were less about desire and more about survival. A widow who remarried quickly after her husband's death was often doing so not out of insufficient grief, but out of the practical reality that she and her children could not survive without the resources that a partnership provided. A young man who delayed marriage for years was often doing so not out of a preference for solitude, but because he lacked the economic means to establish a household. These practical dimensions of partnership and relationship, the ways in which intimate life has always been shaped by economic reality as much as by emotional desire, are often invisible in romantic narratives about human history. But they are among the most consistent features of that history across time and place. To understand how human relationships have actually worked across most of our species' existence, we have to hold together both the genuine emotional depth of human connection and the material constraints within which that connection has always operated. As we move through the historical record from hunter-gatherer bands to agricultural villages to early civilizations to the great empires of antiquity, the diversity of human relationship structures remains striking. Ancient Mesopotamia, one of the earliest literate civilizations, had legal codes that recognized multiple forms of partnership and that distinguished between different categories of wives, concubines, and other recognized intimate partners, each with different legal rights and obligations. ancient Egypt had periods in which sibling marriage among the royal family was not only permitted but expected as a way of keeping the divine bloodline concentrated. The ancient Greeks had elaborate and philosophically sophisticated frameworks for thinking about love that distinguished between different kinds of love. Erotic love, the love of friendship, parental love, the love of wisdom, and that recognized forms of intimate connection between men that their successors in history would condemn. The ancient Romans had a conception of marriage that changed considerably over time, but which at many points was relatively easy to dissolve, and which coexisted, at least among the upper classes, with considerable de facto flexibility about intimate arrangements. Roman women of the upper classes in the late Republic and early Empire had, by some measures, more legal autonomy than women in many subsequent periods of European history. Though thus autonomy existed within a patriarchal framework that still constrained them in fundamental ways, the Haudenosaunee, or Iroquois of North America, developed one of the most sophisticated political systems in the pre-Columbian world, and within that system women held a remarkable degree of social power. Matrilineal descent, thus the tracing of kinship through the mother's line rather than the father's, meant that it was women who controlled access to the longhouses, the central unit of Haudenosaunee social organization. A woman who wished to end a partnership could do so by placing her husband's belongings outside the door of the longhouse. The children remained with the mother and her kin group. This arrangement reflected not a simple inversion of patriarchy, but a sophisticated social system in which power was distributed in ways that did not map neatly onto modern categories. In many parts of sub-Saharan Africa, anthropologists have documented a practice sometimes called woman-woman marriage, in which a woman of high status and sufficient resources would formally marry another woman, take on the social role of husband in the relationship, and be recognized as the social father of any children her wife bore. This arrangement served multiple social functions. It allowed women without male heirs to continue their lineage through the children of their wives. It provided a respectable social framework for women who were widowed, childless, or otherwise in difficult circumstances, and it revealed, in striking fashion, the degree to which the social roles of her husband and wife were understood in these societies as separable from the biological categories of male and female. Across the Pacific, in the islands of Polynesia, anthropologists have documented forms of gender identity and social role that resist reduction to the binary categories of male and female that dominate in most modern Western societies. The Mahu of Hawaii and Tahiti, the Fa'afafini of Samoa, the Fakalati of Tonga, these were people who occupied recognized social roles that combined aspects of both masculine and feminine identity, and that were integrated into the social fabric rather than marginalized from it. Their relationships and partnerships were part of the ordinary texture of social life, neither celebrated as exceptional nor condemned as aberrant. These examples are drawn from a vast and much more complex historical and anthropological record. The point of presenting them is not to suggest that any particular form of human relationship is natural and therefore good, or unnatural and therefore bad. The concepts of natural and unnatural are, in this context, of limited use. Everything that human beings do is, in some sense, natural, because we are natural beings. The remarkable diversity of human relationship forms across time and place is itself a natural fact about our species, a reflection of our extraordinary adaptability, our capacity to create elaborate social structures, and our ability to live in enormous range of physical and social environments. What the diversity of human relationship forms across history tells us, more than anything else, is that our species does not have a single, fixed, biologically determined mode of social organization. We have tendencies, capacities, and emotional architectures that shape the range of what is possible for us. But within that range, the specific forms that relationships take are shaped by culture, by economics, by geography, by religion, by law, and by the countless accumulated choices of communities over generations. This is not a cause for confusion or despair. It is, on reflection, one of the most interesting things about being human. It is worth spending some time with the question of romantic love, with the specific experience of intense, focused attachment to a particular individual that we call falling in love. Because this experience is often treated, in modern culture, as the foundation of all legitimate relationship forms. The idea that a relationship should begin with this experience, and that its presence or absence is the primary measure of a partnership's authenticity and value, is so deeply embedded in contemporary culture that it can be difficult to recognize as the historical novelty that it is. Romantic love, as an experience, is almost certainly ancient. The neurological systems that produce it are the dopaminergic reward systems that create the focused, almost obsessive attention to a particular person that characterizes early-stage romantic attachment, are not cultural inventions. They are part of our biological heritage, and versions of them appear to exist in other pair-bonding species. Anthropologists who have studied societies across the world have found evidence of what appears to be recognizable romantic love in virtually every culture they have examined, including hunter-gatherer societies and other not-industrialized societies. The experience itself is real and ancient, but the idea that romantic love should be the primary or sole basis for choosing a life partner, and that it is such a reliable guide to long-term compatibility, this idea is historically unusual. For most of human history and in most of the world's societies, the selection of a partner was a matter that involved families, communities, economic considerations, and a wide range of social factors, with the personal emotional preferences of the individuals involved playing a relatively limited role. The notion that two individuals should select each other entirely on the basis of their emotional response to each other, without significant input from their families or communities, and that this choice should be expected to sustain a lifetime of shared existence, is a product of relatively recent cultural history in a relatively limited number of societies. This does not mean that historical arranged marriages were loveless or miserable. The anthropological and historical record suggests a much more nuanced picture. Many people in societies where marriage was arranged by families reported deep love and affection for their partners, love that grew and deepened over time through shared experience, mutual care, and the accumulation of a shared life. The trajectory of romantic attachment in many arranged marriages, moving from arrangement to familiarity to affection to love, was simply the reverse of what contemporary romantic culture expects. Neither trajectory is inherently superior. Both can produce genuine and lasting love. Both can fail. What is striking is how differently the two systems distribute the risk of failure. In a system where marriage is arranged and embedded in a web of family and community obligation, the failure of a partnership, while emotionally painful, does not leave the individuals involved without social support. The web of kinship and community remains intact, even if the specific partnership is troubled or dissolves. In a system where the partnership is chosen entirely by the two individuals on the basis of romantic love, and where the partnership is expected to be the primary vehicle for adult intimacy, the failure of a partnership can be socially as well as emotionally devastating. The two people who built their world around each other find themselves, if the partnership ends, suddenly and terribly alone. This is one of the great social challenges of contemporary life in industrialized societies. The romantic partnership model places an extraordinary burden on two individuals. It asks them to be everything to each other in a way that no other social arrangement in human history has asked. And when the partnership cannot sustain that weight, as it often cannot, the consequences for the individuals involved can be severe. Many sociologists and psychologists have argued in recent decades that the rise of depression, loneliness, and social isolation in affluent industrialized societies is related, at least in part, to the erosion of the broader webs of social connection that once surrounded and sustained the romantic partnership. When friendship, kinship, community, and neighbourhood no longer provide the dense web of daily intimacy and mutual obligation that they once did, the romantic partnership becomes overloaded. It is asked to provide everything that human beings need from social connection, and it buckles under the weight. From an evolutionary perspective, this makes considerable sense. Human beings did not evolve to live in isolated nuclear units, each couple responsible for its own economic and emotional survival with minimal support from the surrounding community. We evolved in bands. We evolved in the dense, reciprocal, sometimes irritating, sometimes sustaining intimacy of a group of 50 people who knew each other completely and depended on each other daily. The loneliness that many people in modern societies experience is not, in this view, a personal failing. It is a mismatch between the social environment we evolved for and the social environment we actually inhabit. This is not a counsel of despair. It is rather a piece of historical and evolutionary context that may help us understand our own emotional needs with more compassion and less self-blame. The desire for community, for multiple meaningful relationships, for a sense of belonging to something larger than a couple or a nuclear family. These are not signs of emotional immaturity or an inability to commit. They are among the oldest and most deeply rooted needs of our species. Recognizing them as such is the first step toward finding ways to meet them that are appropriate to the world we actually live in. The history of human relationships is, at its core, a history of creative problem-solving. Human beings have faced, across hundreds of thousands of years, the same fundamental challenges. How to care for children who need years of intensive support. How to maintain social bonds in conditions of uncertainty and scarcity. How to manage the competing desires of individuals within a community that depends on cooperation. How to transmit knowledge and resources across generations. The diversity of relationship forms that human beings have devised in response to these challenges is a testament to our ingenuity and our adaptability. None of the forms that human beings have devised is without its costs. Monogamous pair bonding concentrates emotional risk and can produce devastating isolation when the bond fails. Polygynous arrangements, where they have existed, have typically disadvantaged women and excluded lower status men. Communal child-rearing distributes care broadly, but can diffuse the intensity of individual bonds. Legal and religious frameworks for marriage provide stability and protection, but can also trap people in relationships that have become harmful. Every social arrangement reflects a particular set of trade-offs. a particular way of balancing competing needs and interests. What the long view of human history suggests is that there is no arrangement that is perfect, no solution to the challenges of human social life that does not involve some loss alongside its gains. The question that any society faces is not how to find the ideal relationship structure, but how to construct social arrangements that serve the needs of its members reasonably well, that protect the vulnerable, that provide children with the care they need, that allow adults to live with dignity and connection, and that manage the inevitable conflicts of desire and interest that arise when human beings live closely together. As we move into the later periods of human history, into the agricultural civilizations of the ancient world, the classical empires, the medieval period, the early modern era, the diversity of relationship forms continues, even as the overall trajectory moves in many parts of the world toward greater formalization and restriction. The spread of the world's major religious traditions brought with it, in many cases, new normative frameworks for understanding what relationships should look like. Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, and other traditions each developed their own theologies of gender, sexuality, and partnership, and these theologies shaped the lives of hundreds of millions of people across centuries. These religious frameworks were not simply impositions of power, they also provided genuine meaning, community, and guidance to the people who inhabited them. The language of sacred covenant, of commitment before a community and before the divine, of love as something more than feeling, something more like a practice, a discipline, a daily choice, gave many people a way of understanding the relationships that was genuinely sustaining. The communal dimension of religiously embedded marriage, the sense that a partnership was not only a private matter between two individuals, but a matter of concern to the entire community, echoed in some ways the social embedding of partnership in the hunter-gatherer band. At the same time, the normative frameworks that the major religious traditions imposed on human relationship life also involved, in many cases, significant costs, particularly for those whose desires, identities, or circumstances placed them outside the recognized categories. The history of those costs is long and painful, and it is a history that is still being written in many parts of the world today. The 20th century brought a series of dramatic transformations to the landscape of human relationships in many parts of the world. The widespread availability of reliable contraception, beginning in the 1960s, decoupled sexual intimacy from reproduction in a way that had never before been possible in human history. Women entered the paid workforce in large numbers, gaining economic independence that transformed the material conditions of partnership in fundamental ways. Legal frameworks for marriage and divorce changed dramatically in many countries, making dissolution easier and recognizing forms of partnership that had previously had no legal standing. The feminist movement challenged the power dynamics within partnerships and in the broader social structures that shaped them. The movement for the rights of gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender people challenged the assumption that the only legitimate form of human love was between a man and a woman. These transformations are, in historical terms, extraordinarily recent. They are the product of the last few decades. A blink of an E in the long story of our species, and they are not complete. Around the world, people are still negotiating, sometimes violently, the question of what legitimate human relationship forms look like. The diversity of answers being offered, the insistence in some quarters on returning to older normative frameworks, the insistence in others on expanding the recognized range of human relationship forms as broadly as possible, reflects the deep difficulty of the question and the depth of the values it touches. What the long view of human history can offer in this context is perhaps a kind of steadying perspective. Human beings have always lived with enormous diversity in the forms that their intimate relationships have taken. The insistence that any single form is the only natural, legitimate, or moral one is always, in some sense, a claim made against the grain of the actual historical record. Not every historical form of relationship is something to celebrate or emulate. History contains much that is painful and unjust, but the diversity itself, the sheer range of ways that human beings have found to love each other, to care for each other, to build lives together, is, in its own right, one of the most remarkable things about our species. There is something quietly profound about the realization that humans who painted animals on cave walls in France 30,000 years ago, who gathered around fires on the African savannah 300,000 years ago, who first planted seeds in the Fertile Crescent 10,000 years ago, these people loved. They formed bonds. They felt the pull of attachment and the pain of loss they found in one another. Something that made the difficulty of existence bearable. The specific forms in which they expressed and organized these experiences were shaped by their particular worlds, their particular constraints and possibilities. But the experiences themselves were recognizably human. We are the descendants of those people. We carry in our bodies and our emotional lives the inheritance of 300,000 years of human loving, in all its complexity, all its diversity, all its tenderness and conflict and beauty and grief. The relationships we form are both more constrained and more free than those of our ancestors, in different dimensions and in ways that are difficult to fully measure. We are shaped by histories we did not choose, by norms we did not invent, by economic systems we did not design. And within those shaping forces, we reach toward each other with the same ancient need that our species has always had. The history of human relationships is, in the end, the history of human beings trying to be less alone in a world that is large and uncertain and sometimes frightening. Every form that this effort has taken across all thousands of years and all the countless communities and all the different arrangements of bodies and hearts and obligations, every form has been an answer to that same fundamental longing to be known, to be cared for, to care for another, to belong to something larger than oneself. In a world where the morning brings new uncertainties, where the future is not guaranteed, where the ground beneath us shifts in ways we did not anticipate, this ancient human need has not diminished. It has, if anything, become more urgent and more visible. The long history of our species suggests that we are capable of an extraordinary range of social creativity in responding to this need, that we've invented and can continue to invent forms of community and connection that serve us in the particular conditions we inhabit. And perhaps that is the deepest lesson of that long view. Not that any particular form of relationship is the answer, but that our species has always been in the process of discovering what connection can look like, what love can contain, what it means to build a life with and for and alongside other people. That process has not ended. It is, in every generation, beginning again. The fire is low now. The camp is quiet. Somewhere in the darkness, beyond the circle of warmth, the landscape stretches on in all directions, vast and indifferent to the small bright fact of human love. And yet that love persists. It persists in the grip of a hand, in the sharing of food, in the telling of stories late at night. It persists in the remarkable and continuing effort of our species to find each other, to know each other, to care for each other across all the distances, temporal, cultural, emotional, that separate us. This is what 90% of human history is really made of. Not power and conquest, not the rises and fall of empires, not the great events that fill the pages of conventional history books. It is made of the small and daily acts of human connection, the choice, made again and again across 300,000 years, to reach toward another person in the dark, to say, in whatever language and whatever form the moment allows, "I am here, you're not alone." Let that thought be the last one as the breath slows and the weight of the day begins to lift. The long human story, so varied, so complicated, so full of both darkness and grace, is also, at its core, a love story. Not a simple one, not a clean one, but one that has been going on for longer than we can fully imagine, and one that is still, right now, being told. Rest now. The story will be here in the morning. But before sleep fully comes, it is worth lingering just a little longer in this territory, because the story of human relationships across history is one of those subjects that rewards slow, careful attention. It does not yield its secrets to a quick glance. It requires the kind of patient, unhurried inquiry that is well suited to the late hours, when the mind is quiet and willing to consider things that the busy daylight hours do not easily accommodate. Let us go back then to an earlier point in the story. Let us go back to the bands themselves and think more carefully about what life inside them was actually like. Because the details matter here. The details are where the human reality lives, and the human reality is what we're trying to understand. A band of 40 people moving through a landscape. Imagine the specific texture of that life. Everyone in the group has known everyone else since birth. There are no strangers in this world, or at least very few, and strangers are both a source of potential danger and a source of intense fascination. The social world of a band member is, by the standards of modern life, extremely small, but it is also extraordinarily deep. The knowledge that the members of a band have of one another is the kind of knowledge that most people in modern societies rarely acquire about anyone. It is the knowledge that comes from spending every day together for an entire lifetime, from sleeping in the same space, from sharing food from the same pot, from witnessing each other's illnesses and recoveries, each other's grief and joy, each other's moments of courage and moments of weakness. In this environment, the nature of intimate relationships takes on a specific character that is worth thinking about carefully. In a world where everyone knows everything about everyone, privacy in the modern sense is essentially absent. The relationship between any two people in the group is not a private matter. It is witnessed, commented upon, shaped by and embedded in the awareness of the entire group. When two people quarrel, the whole group is aware of it and affected by it. When two people are particularly happy together, the whole group feels the warmth of that. When a relationship is in difficulty, the group has an interest in its resolution because the social harmony of the entire band depends on the ability of its members to function cooperatively with one another. This has profound implications for how relationships were likely experienced. The intensity of mutual scrutiny in a small band could be at times suffocating. There was nowhere to hide, no privacy to retreat into, no anonymity to offer relief from the weight of being so thoroughly known And yet this same intensity of mutual knowledge created a kind of security that is extremely rare in modern life. To be completely known and still accepted, to have one's full self, including the parts that are difficult or embarrassing or shameful, witnessed by the people who nonetheless continue to feed and care for and cooperate with you, is a form of belonging that most modern people have experienced only fleetingly, if at all. The anthropologist Polly Wiesner, who spent decades studying the Juhwanzi San people of southern Africa, made a fascinating observation about the role of conversation and storytelling in maintaining social bonds within hunter-gatherer groups. Wiesner analysed the content of conversations among the Juhwanzi and found that a striking proportion of nighttime conversation around the fire after the work of the day was done, was devoted to stories about social relationships, about the behaviour of people both within and outside the group, about questions of fairness and reputation and reciprocity. This kind of conversation served a social function. It was the mechanism by which the group processed and calibrated its shared understanding of who its members were and how they were relating to each other. In a world where reputation is everything, where your survival literally depends on your standing within the group, the constant monitoring and discussion of social relationships is not gossip in the trivial, modern sense of the word. It is a form of social intelligence and social maintenance without which the group cannot function. It is how norms are enforced, how deviations are noticed and addressed, how conflicts are identified and resolved before they escalate to a point that threatens the group's cohesion. And it is, not incidentally, how the emotional lives of individuals are validated and witnessed. When you tell the story of what happened between you and another person in the group, you're not simply passing time. You're inviting the community to help you understand and process your experience, to affirm your perception of events, to help you find a path forward that will preserve both your dignity and the social fabric of the group. This communal processing of intimate life is something that has become much rarer in modern societies. The expectation in contemporary life is that emotional difficulties within partnerships should be managed primarily within the partnership itself, or with the help of a professional therapist who is outside the social network entirely. The idea that one's friends, family and neighbours should be deeply involved in the working out of intimate difficulties is often experienced in modern culture as intrusive or infantilizing. And yet the communal processing of intimate life is what human beings evolved for. It is the mechanism by which our ancestors navigated the inevitable difficulties of living closely together. The rise of the professional therapist is, in one sense, a remarkable cultural adaptation, a way of providing in a changed social environment something approximating the function that was once served by the broader community. But it is also a measure of how far the social environment has changed. The therapist is a stranger, bound by professional ethics to maintain confidentiality, who is paid to hear and respond to what the community once heard and responded to freely. The existence of this profession, and the scale to which it has grown in many industrialized societies, is one of many indicators of the degree to which modern social arrangements have created gaps in the web of human connection that our species evolved to inhabit. There is another dimension of hunter-gatherer social life that bears careful attention, and that is the question of how relationships between people of different generations were structured. In a small band, the members of different generations live in constant proximity and constant interaction. The very young and the very old are not separated from the middle generations, as they are, to a considerable degree, in modern societies. Children grow up in the continuous presence of grandparents, and grandparents spend their later years in the continuous presence of grandchildren. This daily proximity creates relationships of great depth and importance. The evolutionary anthropologist Kristen Hawkes, who has worked extensively with the Wahadza of Tanzania, developed an influential hypothesis about the role of grandmothers in human evolution that has come to be known as the grandmother hypothesis. The core of the hypothesis is that human females, uniquely among great apes, live for a substantial period after their own reproductive years have ended. Now, in most species, there is little reason for females to survive much beyond their reproductive period, because evolution selects for traits that enhance reproduction, not for traits that maintain life after reproduction is no longer possible. The existence of post-reproductive longevity in human females, the fact that women commonly live for decades after menopause, requires some explanation in evolutionary terms. Hawkes's explanation is that post-reproductive women, grandmothers, provided sufficiently valuable support to their daughters and grandchildren to justify, from an evolutionary standpoint, the extension of lifespan beyond the reproductive period. A grandmother who was alive and active could help her daughter forage for food, could carry and care for young grandchildren, could transmit knowledge about which plants were edible and where water could be found in times of drought. This assistance allowed her daughter to have more children in quicker succession than would otherwise have been possible, and allowed more of those children to survive. Over many generations, this created a selection pressure in favour of longer post-reproductive lifespan in human females. What is striking about this hypothesis, from the perspective of the history of relationships, is what it implies about the centrality of intergenerational bonds in human social life. The grandmother is not a peripheral figure in human evolution. She is on this account one of the key figures around whom the entire architecture of human social organization is built. The deep bond between grandmother and grandchild, the love and knowledge and care that flow across generations, is not a sentimental addition to the core structure of human society. It is quite possibly part of that core structure woven into the social fabric of our species by hundreds of thousands of years of evolutionary selection. This has interesting implications for how we think about the diversity of human relationship forms. If the bond between grandmothers and grandchildren is evolutionarily significant, if it has played a real role in shaping who we are as a species, then it belongs in any account of the human relational landscape, alongside the romantic partnership, the parent-child bond, the sibling relationship, and the bonds of friendship and community. The narrowing of our attention in modern discourse about relationships to the romantic partnership as the primary or most important human bond is, from this perspective, a historically parochial view that misrepresents the actual breadth and depth of human relational life. The relationship between siblings is another form of human bond that deserves attention in this context. In hunter-gatherer bands and in many pre-industrial societies, the sibling relationship was among the most durable and important bonds that an individual possessed. Siblings grew up together, cooperated in the work of subsistence, shared the obligations of care for parents and younger siblings, and often lived in close proximity throughout their adult lives. The alliance between siblings, and particularly between brothers in societies where male cooperation in hunting and defence was especially important, was a form of social bond that could be as practically significant as the bond between partners. In many traditional societies, the relationship between a man and his wife's brother, the brother-in-law relationship, was encoded in elaborate sets of mutual obligations and recognized as one of the most important alliances an adult male could possess. The creation of a marital bond was, in this social context, not only a bond between two individuals, but a bond between two kin groups, creating new obligations and alliances that extended across both extended families. Marriage, in this understanding, was fundamentally a social and political act, as well as a personal and emotional one. It reorganized the social landscape around the two individuals by creating new ties between their respective kin groups. This understanding of partnership as a kinship-creating act, rather than simply a personal choice between two individuals, is one that has been common across an enormous range of human societies throughout history. The modern Western understanding of marriage as primarily a matter of personal choice and personal feeling, as something that concerns the two individuals above all, with their families in a secondary and largely advisory role, is, in historical terms, a minority view. Most human society throughout most of human history have understood partnership as too important a social act to be left entirely to the preferences of the individuals involved. This is not simply a matter of tradition for tradition's sake. The broader social embedding of partnership serves real and important functions. When a partnership is formed within a web of family and community obligation, the maintenance of that partnership is supported by social pressure and social interests that extend beyond the couple themselves. The families of both partners have an investment in the partnership's success and will often provide support and mediation when the partnership is in difficulty. The community within which the partnership is embedded has norms and mechanisms for managing marital difficulty that the partners can draw upon. When those external supports are removed, the partnership is understood as purely a private matter between two individuals who have chosen each other freely and bear the full responsibility for the success or failure of their union. The weight on the individuals is correspondingly greater, and the resources available to them in times of difficulty are correspondingly fewer. The freedom that comes with the modern romantic model of partnership is real and valuable, but it comes with a corresponding increase in vulnerability and risk. Let us move now to a different dimension of this history. The question of how relationships between people of the same sex have been understood and organized across the long arc of human history. This is a subject that has been marked, in recent decades, by considerable social and political contestation, and it requires careful handling. But it is also a subject on which the historical and anthropological record is rich and illuminating, and it deserves a place in any serious account of the diversity of human relational experience. The anthropological record is clear on one point. Same-sex desire and same-sex intimate bonds have been present in human communities across recorded history, and across a very wide range of cultures. This is not a modern phenomenon or a Western invention, as it has sometimes been characterized. It is a consistent feature of human social life that appears in the documentation of communities on every inhabited continent and in every historical period for which we have sufficient records. How those desires and bonds have been understood, categorized and evaluated has varied enormously, but their presence is not in question. In classical Athens, the most celebrated and philosophically developed culture of the ancient Greek world, intimate relationships between men were not only permitted but were, in certain forms, actively celebrated as the highest expression of erotic and intellectual connection. The Symposium of Plato one of the most enduring works of Western philosophy. It's, among other things, a document of this cultural reality. The speeches given at the dinner party that the dialogue describes are speeches about love in its many forms, and they include accounts of desire between men that are presented not as aberrant or shameful, but as natural and philosophically significant. The relationship between an older man and a younger man in classical Athens, the Erastus and the Euonymus, was a recognized social institution with its own norms and expectations. It was understood to involve not only erotic desire but also mentorship, education, and the formation of character. The older partner was expected to take responsibility for the education and social development of the younger, and the relationship was evaluated, at least in the ideal, not simply by the pleasure it provided, but by the degree to which it contributed to the younger man's formation as a citizen and a person of excellence. This is not to romanticize a social institution that was also deeply embedded in the power inequalities of ancient Athenian society, in which women were excluded from public life, in which slavery was ubiquitous, and in which the norms governing the Eros-Romanus relationship were not always observed in ways that modern ethics would find acceptable. History rarely offers clean moral models, but it does offer evidence, and the evidence from ancient Athens is that same-sex desire was incorporated into the social fabric in ways that were normalized and philosophically engaged with, rather than driven to the margins. Similar evidence exists across many other cultures and periods. In feudal Japan, relationships between male Buddhist monks and younger male novices or apprentices, known as wakashudo or shuto, were recognized and elaborated in a cultural tradition that produced its own literary genre, codes of conduct, and aesthetic conventions. In the cultures of the ancient Near East, evidence for same-sex relationships appears in the literary and archaeological record, though it is often interpreted through frameworks that are themselves contested. In many indigenous cultures of the Americas, people who occupied gender roles outside the binary of male and female, sometimes called two-spirit people by pan-Indian advocacy groups, though the specific traditions varied enormously across different nations, were often recognized as possessing particular spiritual gifts and occupied specific social roles within their communities. Across sub-Saharan Africa, despite the common contemporary claim that same-sex relationships are foreign to African tradition and were introduced by European colonialism, anthropologists and historians have documented same-sex practices and relationships in pre-colonial societies across the continent. The evidentiary record includes accounts from early European travellers who observe such practices with astonishment, accounts that are significant, precisely because the travellers had no motive to invent what they described, and every cultural motive to suppress or minimise it. In China, the historical record documents a long tradition of same-sex desire and intimate relationships, particularly among men, that was incorporated into literary and artistic culture in complex and sometimes celebratory ways. The cut sleeve, a term derived from a Han Dynasty story about an emperor who cut off his sleeve rather than disturb his sleeping male favourite, became a literary trope for male same-sex love that persisted through many subsequent dynasties. The tradition of male same-sex love was, in pre-modern China, not a hidden subculture but a visible and recognized feature of social life, at least among certain social classes and in certain periods. What changed this relatively widespread tolerance or acceptance in many parts of the world was the spread of particular religious and legal frameworks that classified same-sex desire and same-sex relationships as not merely sinful, but as a fundamental violation of the natural order. The history of how and why these frameworks developed, and how they spread through processes of colonization and cultural influence, is too complex to trace in detail here. But its consequences were severe and lasted for centuries. The criminalization of same-sex relationships in many parts of the world, the medical pathologization of same-sex desire in the 19th and early 20th centuries, and the social stigma and persecution that accompanied these frameworks caused enormous suffering to an enormous number of people. The gradual reversal of these frameworks in many, though not all, parts of the world over the past several decades is, in historical perspective, a return toward a more diverse and more historically representative understanding of the range of human intimate life. It does not represent, as it is sometimes characterized, a radical departure from human tradition. It represents in part a recovery of a broader and older understanding of what human beings can be to one another. Having traced this long arc of diversity, it is worth returning to the question of what all this history means for our understanding of contemporary relationships, of the situations that people navigate in their daily lives right now, in a world that is simultaneously more connected and more isolated than any world our ancestors inhabited. One thing that the history of human relationships makes clear is that the forms that those relationships take are never simply given by nature. They are always constructed, shaped by culture, economics, religion, law, and the daily choices of communities and individuals. This means that they can be changed. It also means that changes in relationship forms, when they occur, always reflect changes in the broader social conditions within which relationships are embedded. Relationship forms do not change because individuals decide to change them in isolation. They change because the social landscape that surrounds and shapes them has shifted in ways that make new forms possible, necessary or desirable. The social landscape of contemporary life has shifted dramatically and with remarkable speed. The economic independence of women, still incomplete but dramatically greater than it was a century ago, has transformed the conditions of partnership in ways that are still working themselves out. The lengthening of human lifespans has created a new situation in which two people who bond in their 20s may find themselves together for 60 or 70 years, a duration that was simply not available to most people in earlier periods of history when life expectancy was much shorter. This geographic mobility of modern life has transformed the relationship between individuals and the communities they grew up in, often severing the bonds of kinship and neighbourhood that once provided the social container for intimate life. The digital revolution has added further layers of complexity to this already transformed landscape. The ability to communicate instantly with people anywhere in the world, to form intimate connections across geographic distance, to maintain relationships that would have been impossible to sustain in previous eras, these are genuinely new capacities that create new possibilities and new challenges simultaneously. The landscape of human intimate life in the 21st century is, in many ways, without historical precedent. There are no established traditions that provide clear guidance for navigating it, because no previous generation of human beings has inhabited anything quite like it. And yet, in the midst of all this novelty, the fundamental emotional needs that drive human beings toward relationship remain changed. The need for attachment, for belonging, for being known and cared for caring for others, for finding meaning in connections, and these are as old as our species, and they have not been transformed by the digital revolution or the economic emancipation of women or the extension of legal recognition to previously excluded relationship forms. They are the constants that run through the entire long history of human relationship diversity. If there is a lesson in that long history, it may be something like this. Human beings have always found a way to meet these needs, even in the most constrained and difficult circumstances. The forms they have used has been extraordinarily diverse. Many of those forms have been marked by injustice and suffering, particularly for those who are most vulnerable. Women, children, those with the fewest resources. But even in the most constrained circumstances, human beings have found ways to love, to connect, to build webs of mutual care and obligation that make life bearable and sometimes beautiful. The history of human relationships is, among other things, the history of human resilience. It is the story of a species that has faced, again and again, conditions of extreme difficulty and uncertainty, and that has responded to those conditions not by giving up on connection, but by finding new forms in which connection could survive. The hunter-gatherer band was one such form. The extended family systems of early agricultural societies were another. The village communities of the medieval world were another. The reformed family structures of the industrial era were another. Each of these was an adaptation, an attempt to meet the enduring human need for connection in the specific conditions of its time. The forms that human beings are developing now in the 21st century are all sort of adaptations, attempts to meet that same enduring need in conditions of unprecedented change and complexity. The rise of chosen family, the deliberate construction of close-knit communities of friendship and mutual support that function like family, is one such adaptation. The growing recognition of non-hierarchical relationship models in which multiple close bonds are explicitly acknowledged and valued rather than hidden or denied is another. The expansion of legal recognition to a wider range of partnership forms is another. None of these is perfect. All of them involve trade-offs, but all of them reflect the enduring human impulse to find each other, to build connection, to create, in whatever way the specific moment allows, something that feels like home. There is, finally, something worth saying about the experience of solitude in the context of this long history of human connection. Because connection has been so central to human survival and human flourishing, the experience of being alone, truly alone, without the web of community and relationship that our species evolved within, is among the most painful experiences that human beings can have. Loneliness is not a minor inconvenience. It registers in the brain, in the body, as a form of pain. The neuroscience of loneliness confirms what poets and philosophers have long known. Isolation from others is genuinely harmful to human beings in ways that go well beyond the merely psychological. And yet, within the social life of hunter-gatherer bands and many traditional societies, there was also a recognized and valued role for solitude of a particular kind. Not the involuntary isolation of loneliness, but the voluntary withdrawal from the group for specific purposes, for spiritual seeking, for healing, for the kind of deep reflection that the constant noise of community life makes difficult. The vision quests of many indigenous North American traditions, the retreats of Buddhist and Christian monks, the solitary wanderings described in the spiritual autobiographies of mystics across many traditions. These practices acknowledge that the individual, embedded in the community, sometimes needs to withdraw from that embeddedness in order to find something that the community itself cannot provide. This is a subtlety that the simple equation of connection with good and solitude with bad misses. Human beings need both. They need the deep embeddedness of community life, the daily intimacy of being thoroughly known and thoroughly belonging to a group. And they need, periodically, the capacity to stand apart from that embeddedness and see it from the outside. The monasteries that developed across different religious traditions were, in one sense, specialized social institutions for managing this paradox. Communities of people who had chosen to withdraw from ordinary social life in order to live a more deliberately examined version of it, who were simultaneously more solitary than most people in their cultures and more communally embedded than most modern people. The tension between belonging and individuality, between embeddedness in community and the autonomous self that stands apart from community, this tension is ancient, and it runs through the entire history of human relationship. It appears in a prehistoric record in the tension between the band's claim on the individual and the individual's capacity for choice. It appears in the religious record in the tension between the demands of religious community and the inner life of the soul. It appears in the modern record in the tension between the demands of partnership and family and the equally real need for personal space, autonomy, and individual identity. This tension is not a problem to be solved. It is a feature of human existence, perhaps one of its most fundamental features. We are, at the same time, profoundly social creatures who cannot flourish without others, and profoundly individual creatures who have inner lives that cannot be wholly shared or wholly contained by any social form. The dance between these two aspects of our nature is what gives human relational life its depth and its difficulty and its richness. All the history we have moved through tonight, the hunter-gatherer bands, the matrilineal longhouses, the societies of partible paternity, the philosophical frameworks of ancient Greece, the sacred covenants of religious tradition, the legal revolutions of the 20th century, all of it is, at some level, an expression of this fundamental human dance, the search for forms that honour both the deep need for connection and the deep need for the self to remain itself, the search for ways of being together that do not require the erasure of any part of what we are. That search has not ended. It continues in your own life, and in the lives of everyone you know, in forms that are particular to this moment and this world, shaped by conditions that are different from any that came before. And it will continue, if the long record of our species is any guide, for as long as human beings exist to reach toward one another across the beautiful and bewildering distance that separates each self from every other. Sleep now. The night is deep and the world is quiet. All the long history of human longing and human love rests for a moment in the stillness, patient and unchanging beneath the turning of the stars, and somewhere in the dark, a hand reaches for another hand. That is how it has always been. That is enough. And yet, because the night is long and the mind is still restless, still curious, still moving through the corridors of this ancient question, let us continue a little further, because there is more to be said, and the saying of it may be its own form of rest. Consider for a moment the question of jealousy. It is one of the most uncomfortable of human emotions, and one of the most universal. Every culture that has been studied in sufficient depth has shown evidence of jealousy, of the particular pain that arises when we fear that someone we love is being drawn toward another, that the bond between us and them is being weakened or replaced. This is not a modern invention or a cultural construction in any simple sense. It is something very old, something that appears to be woven into the architecture of human emotional life at a level that predates any specific cultural framework. From an evolutionary perspective, jealousy makes considerable sense. In a species where the investment required to raise a child is enormous, and where the biological fitness of an individual depends in part on the success of their offspring, the emotional systems that monitor and protect the bond between partners have real survival value. An individual who felt nothing when their partner formed other close bonds would be, in the evolutionary logic of natural selection, at a disadvantage compared to one whose emotional architecture prompted them to notice and respond to potential threats to the partnership. But here is what is interesting. The fact that jealousy is ancient and partially explicable in evolutionary terms does not tell us very much about what to do with it, or about what social arrangements will most effectively manage it. Human emotional architecture contains many systems that were adaptive in the environments in which they evolved, but that create difficulties in changed conditions. The anxiety response that was adaptive when the threat was a predator can become a chronic burden when the threats are social and abstract. The craving for calorie-dense food that was adaptive when food was scarce can become destructive when calorie-dense food is everywhere. The jealousy response that was adaptive in the social conditions of the Pleistocene may not map cleanly onto the social conditions of the 21st century. And here, history has something genuinely useful to say. Different. Human societies have developed very different social technologies for managing jealousy, for acknowledging the emotional reality of the response, while creating social conditions that prevent it from becoming destructive to the individuals involved or to the community. The extensive ethnographic literature on hunter-gatherer societies and other small-scale traditional societies is full of accounts of these social technologies, and they are worth attending to carefully. Among some groups, the management of jealousy was accomplished in part through the careful structuring of relationships and obligations. A person who had a recognized bond with one partner also had recognized bonds of different kinds with many other members of the group. The network of relationship and obligation was dense enough that no single bond occupied the entire emotional landscape of any individual's social world. This did not eliminate jealousy, but it placed it within a social context that provided more resources for matching it than the isolated dyad of a modern couple living without community. Among other groups, this management of jealousy was accomplished in part through humour and teasing, through social practices that acknowledged the emotional reality of jealousy while gently deflating its more destructive potential. Among the Inuit of the Arctic regions, ethnographers have documented a tradition of spouse exchange between close friends, a practice that was understood not as a violation of the marital bond but as an expression of the deep trust and friendship between the couples involved. The management of potential jealousy in this context was accomplished through the explicit framework of friendship and mutual trust, through the understanding that the exchange was not a threat to the primary bond but an expression of the social values of generosity and sharing that the entire community was organized around. This example is culturally specific and historically situated, and it would be naive to suggest that it maps directly onto any contemporary situation. But it illustrates a broader point. Human societies have been extraordinarily creative in developing social frameworks for managing the emotional challenges that arise from the realities of desire and attachment in a communal setting. The idea that jealousy is simply an inevitable source of destruction, against which the only protection is the strict enforcement of exclusive monogamy, is not a conclusion that the historical record supports. It is one particular social technology among many. The regulation of sexual access and the management of resulting emotions have been the subject of elaborate social engineering in virtually every human society that has been studied. The rules that different societies have developed, rules about who can bond with whom, under what conditions, with what obligations and what prohibitions, reflect not only the moral values of those societies, but also their practical social logic. The rules are attempts to solve real problems, how to prevent the kind of conflict over sexual access that would be socially destructive, how to create conditions of sufficient predictability and security for individuals to form long-term bonds and invest in children, how to maintain the cooperative networks that make group survival possible. Different societies have arrived at very different solutions to these problems. Strict monogamy, in which each individual has one recognized partner and all other sexual access is prohibited and punished, is one solution. It creates high levels of predictability and security for the individuals within recognized partnerships, at the cost of significant constraint on individual desire, and historically significant enforcement costs. Polygyny, in which men with sufficient resources may have multiple wives, is another solution, one that concentrates reproductive access among higher status men, and that has typically involved significant disadvantage for women and lower status men. Polyandry, in which a woman has multiple recognized husbands, is far rarer in the historical record, but has been documented in certain ecological and social contexts, particularly in parts of Tibet and among some communities in South Asia, where the practice of fraternal polyandry, in which brothers share a wife, served among other things to prevent the fragmentation of landholdings across generations. The ecological explanation for fraternal polyandry is particularly illuminating. In the high-altitude agricultural environments of Tibet, arable land was extremely limited and precarious. If brothers each married separately and established separate households, the family land would be divided among multiple households, with each generation eventually becoming too small to sustain any of them. Fraternal polyandry prevented this fragmentation by keeping brothers and their shared wife in a single household. The children of the marriage were raised as a single family, regardless of their specific biological paternity. The arrangement was not presented as ideal in some philosophical sense, but as a practical solution to the specific ecological and economic constraints of the environment. This illustrates, with particular clarity, the degree to which the forms of human intimate life are shaped by the material conditions of existence. The moral frameworks that different societies have developed around intimate life often obscure this material foundation, presenting as eternal moral truth what is, in significant part, an adaptation to specific historical and ecological circumstances. When those circumstances change, as they inevitably do, the moral frameworks often lag behind, persisting as a cultural inheritance even after the practical conditions that generated them have disappeared. The history of the sexual division of labour is another dimension of human relational history that deserves careful attention, because it is so deeply intertwined with the forms that intimate relationships have taken. In hunter-gatherer societies, the division of labour between men and women was typically significant but not absolute. Men tended to do more of the hunting, particularly the pursuit of large game, while women tended to do more of the gathering of plant foods and small animals. But the boundaries were permeable, and the degree of rigidity in the division varied considerably across different groups and different environments. What is important to understand is that in most hunter-gatherer societies, the work done by women, the gathering of plant foods, provided the majority of the caloric intake of the group. The hunting done by men was nutritionally important and socially significant, but it was less reliable and provided less of the group's total food supply than the gathering done by women. This means that women's economic contribution to the group's survival was, in most contexts, at least equal to and often greater than men's. Women in hunter-gatherer societies were not economic dependents. They were economic contributors who controlled the resources they gathered and who had real leverage in the social negotiations that shaped the life of the group. The transition to agriculture shifted this balance in many contexts. Plough agriculture, in particular, tends to favour upper body strength in ways that disadvantage women relative to men. As agriculture intensified and plough cultivation spread, the economic contributions of women and men in many agrarian societies became more differentiated, with men doing more of the field labours and women doing more of the domestic labour of food processing, textile production and childcare. This economic differentiation had real consequences for the relative power of women within partnerships and within the broader social structure. But even within this broad pattern, the historical reality was more varied and complex than a simple narrative of increasing female subordination would suggest. In many agricultural societies, women maintained substantial economic roles and real social influence, particularly in the management of the household economy, which was, in pre-industrial contexts, a more significant economic unit than the term might suggest to modern ears. The household was not simply a domestic space. It was often a centre of production, of food processing, textile production, and the management of animals. And the woman who managed it was managing a real economic enterprise, the economic transformations of the Industrial Revolution, which moved much of the production that had previously occurred within the household into factories and workshops outside the home, had complex and contradictory effects on women's economic position. On the one hand, industrialization created new opportunities for women to earn wages outside the home. On the other hand, it separated the sphere of paid work from the sphere of domestic life in ways that created a new ideological framework, the ideology of separate spheres, that presented domestic life as the natural and appropriate domain of women and public economic life as the natural and appropriate domain of men. This framework, which was presented in its time as reflecting natural and eternal truths about the differences between men and women, was in fact a historically specific product of the particular economic arrangements of industrializing societies. The feminist movements of the 19th and 20th centuries were in significant part responses to the constraints imposed by this ideology of separate spheres. The demand for women's suffrage, for access to education and the professions, for equal pay and equal treatment under the law. These were demands for access to the public sphere of economic and political life that the ideology of separate spheres had declared off-limits to women. The success of these movements, partial and still ongoing, but real, has transformed the conditions of partnership in industrialized societies in ways that are still working themselves out. One of the most significant and least discussed consequences of women's increasing economic independence in the 20th century has been the transformation of the practical basis of partnership. When marriage was, for most women, the only available means of economic support, the decision to enter a partnership was constrained by economic necessity in ways that were fundamentally different from the conditions that exist when both partners have the option of economic independence. The possibility of economic independence does not eliminate the desire for partnership. Human beings want connection for reasons that go well beyond economics, but it transforms the conditions under which partnership is entered and sustained. A partnership that is freely chosen by both parties from a position of relative economic independence is a different social and emotional reality from a partnership entered into under conditions of economic compulsion. The freedom brings with it genuine goods, more authentic choice, more equal power within the relationship, more possibility for the relationship to reflect what both partners actually want rather than what economic necessity dictates. But it also brings with it new vulnerabilities. A partnership that was always freely chosen can also be freely ended, and the possibility of ending it is therefore always present in a way that it was not when leaving was economically prohibitive. This creates for many people a kind of background anxiety about the security of the partnership that may have been less present, or present in different forms, when the structural constraints on leaving were stronger. This is not an argument against women's economic independence. It is an observation about the ways in which the structural conditions that shape partnership affect the emotional experience of being in one. The history of human relationships is not a history of simple progress from worse to better, or from constraint to freedom. It is a history of trade-offs, of gains in some dimensions, accompanied by costs in others, of solutions to one set of problems that create new sets of problems in turn. Understanding this does not mean accepting it as inevitable. It means approaching the present with the kind of historical perspective that can help us identify which features of our situation are genuinely new, and which are new variations on old challenges that human beings have been grappling with for a very long time. The question of what makes a relationship durable, what allows a bond between people to survive the inevitable difficulties and changes that any sustained connection will face, is one that has occupied human beings for as long as we've been reflecting on our own social lives. The answers that different traditions have offered are various, and none of them is complete. Religious traditions have often located the durability of relationships in their sacred character, in the understanding that the bond between partners is not only a human agreement, but covenant witnessed and sanctified by something beyond the human. This framing has genuine psychological and social power. A partnership that is understood as sacred, as something that transcends the preferences and momentary feelings of the individuals involved, is harder to dissolve than one that is understood as purely a product of those preferences and feelings. The social weight of a religious community that has witnessed and celebrates the partnership, and that would view its dissolution as a spiritual as well as a social failure, provides real support for the maintenance of the bond. Secular traditions have tended to locate the durability of relationships in other qualities, in the depth of friendship between partners, in shared values and shared projects, in the quality of communication and mutual understanding, in the deliberate cultivation of what researchers have described as emotional attunement and repair. These frameworks have their own power. Relationships that are built on genuine friendship, on real knowledge of and respect for each other's inner lives, on the capacity to navigate conflict without contempt or withdrawal. These relationships have resources for durability that are not dependent on any particular external framework. What both the religious and secular frameworks share at their best is a recognition that durable relationships require something more than initial attraction and early-stage romantic feeling. They require commitment, Not only the formal commitment of a ceremony or a legal agreement, but the deeper commitment of choosing again and again to invest in the relationship, even when it is difficult, to prioritize the partnership's health over short-term individual comfort, to develop the skills and practices that allow the partnership to grow and change over time without losing its essential character. The hunter-gatherer band had its own form of this. In a band where everyone depended on everyone else for survival, the commitment to the group and to the specific relationships within it was enforced not by ceremony or law, but by the practical reality that there was no viable alternative. You could not simply leave and find another group whenever the relationships into your current group became difficult. You were embedded in this group, dependent on it, known by it. The durability of relationships in that context was supported by the absence of easy exit, but also by the social skills and practices that communities developed for managing the inevitable difficulties of close human coexistence. Modern societies have traded the lack of exit options for the presence of real freedom to choose. The costs of that trade include the loss of the social embeddedness that made durability easier, even as it reduced individual freedom. The gains include this genuine possibility of authentic choice, of partnerships that are sustained not by necessity, but by the ongoing, renewable choice of two people who prefer to be together. Both the costs and the gains are real. Understanding both is part of what the long view of human history can offer us. Before this long and gentle journey through the history of human connection comes to its close, it is worth pausing to acknowledge something that can easily be lost in any academic or historical account of this subject: the sheer, felt reality of human love in all its forms, as it has been experienced by the countless billions of individual human beings who have lived and loved across our species' long history. Every social structure, every kinship system, every legal framework, every religious covenant that we have discussed tonight was, at its core, a setting within which individual human beings experienced the full range of what love and connection and loss feel like from the inside. Behind every archaeological data point, every ethnographic observation, every historical record, there were people. Specific, irreplaceable, feeling people who are doing their best to navigate the profound difficulty and the profound gift of being alive and connected to others. A woman in a Neolithic village, rising before dawn to begin the day's work, pausing for a moment in the doorway to look at the still sleeping form of the person with whom she has built her life. An elderly man in a hunter-gatherer band watching his grandchildren play, knowing himself part of a chain of care that extends back beyond memory and forward beyond imagination. A young person in the ancient world falling in love for the first time, bewildered by the intensity of what they feel, certain that no one has ever felt exactly this before, unaware that this certainty itself is one of the most universal features of the experience. These moments, private, interior, beyond the reach of any archive or any analytical framework, are the substance of the history we have been tracing. The social structures and the legal frameworks and the economic conditions are real and important, but they are ultimately the containers within which these interior moments occur. The containers shape the moments in ways that we have been examining, but the moments are what the containers are for, and those moments of genuine connection, of love given and received, of care extended and gratitude felt, are, across all the diversity of their cultural containers and all the variation of their specific forms, recognizably the same. The mother nursing her child in the Paleolithic cave and the mother nursing her child in the modern hospital are doing the same thing, feeling something that is, at its core, the same thing. The recognition of beloved face across a crowded room happened in the markets of ancient Mesopotamia just as it happens in contemporary cities. The grief of loss of a partner, a child, a close friend has felt in its essential quality the same way in every time and every place that human beings have experienced it. This is perhaps the most important thing that the long view of human history can offer us. Not the particulars of which social arrangements worked better or worse. Not the list of forms that human relationships have taken. Not even the evolutionary explanations for why we are the way we are. The most important thing is the reminder that all of these specific, varied, historically contingent forms of human relationship have been in service of something that is neither specific nor varied nor historically contingent. They have been in service of the irreducible human need to love and be loved, to know and be known, to find in the presence of another person a mirror that makes the self feel real and a warmth that makes the world feel less cold. That need is as old as our species. It will last as long as our species lasts. No revolution in technology or economics or legal frameworks will eliminate it or transform it beyond recognition. It will adapt. It will find new expressions, new containers, new forms that fit the specific conditions of whatever world human beings are living in. But it will persist because it is not a cultural invention, it is what we are. And knowing that, holding that knowledge gently in the quiet of the late hour, there is something that feels almost like peace. The world is complicated. Human history is complicated. The specific forms that love and connection take are always changing, always shaped by forces larger than any individual, always imperfect in ways that are sometimes painful and sometimes unjust. But through all of that complication and all of that change, the essential human impulse toward connection has persisted. It survived ice ages and migrations and famines and plagues and wars and the slow, grinding pressure of oppressive social structures. It has survived, and it has found a way. That is not a small thing. In fact, it may be the most remarkable thing about us. The fire is low, the breathing slows, the weight of history, which is also the weight of love, settles gently over the quiet mind like a blanket of great age and great warmth. Rest now. The story will be here in the morning, and you are part of it, a thread in the long, continuous weaving that began 300,000 years ago and has not stopped since. You carry in your bones and your blood and your capacity for feeling the inheritance of all the love that has ever been felt by all the people who came before you. That inheritance is not a burden. It is a gift. Carry it gently. It is enough. It has always been enough. There's one final thread to follow before the night fully closes. It concerns the question of friendship, which the long history of human relationships has often treated as secondary to romantic partnership, but which in the actual texture of human lives across history has been just as central, and sometimes more so. The Greek philosopher Aristotle, writing in the 4th century before the Common Era, devoted substantial portions of his ethical writings to the subject of friendship. He argued that there were 3 kinds of friendship, distinguished by what each party found valuable in the other. Friendships based on utility, in which each party benefits from the practical assistance of the other. Friendships based on pleasure, in which each party enjoys the company of the other, and friendships based on virtue, in which each party recognizes and values the genuine goodness of character in the other. This third kind, the friendship of virtue, Aristotle considered the highest form of human bond because it was based not on what the other person could do for you or how they made you feel, but on who they actually were. What is striking about Aristotle's treatment of friendship is the seriousness with which he approached it as a subject of philosophical and ethical inquiry. Friendship, in his account, was not a supplementary emotional comfort added on top of the serious business of civic and family life. It was itself one of the most important goods that a human life could contain. The person who lacked genuine friends was, in Aristotle's view, impoverished in a fundamental way, regardless of whatever other goods they might possess. A good life required good friendships. This was not a sentimental claim. It was a philosophical argument, developed with great care and precision. This philosophical seriousness about friendship reflects something important about the social world in which Aristotle lived. In classical Athens, as in many pre-modern societies, friendship was a politically and socially significant bond, not merely a private emotional comfort. Friendships between men in ancient Athens carried specific social obligations of loyalty, of mutual support, of speaking well of each other in the competitive public arena of civic life. The bond of friendship was something that was performed publicly as well as experienced privately, and its violation was a serious social failing that could damage a person's reputation and standing in the community. In many traditional societies around the world, what anthropologists call bond friendship, a formalized, often ritually sealed friendship between two individuals who are not kin, served important social and economic functions. Bond friends were people who had made explicit commitments to each other, who were obligated to provide hospitality, assistance in times of difficulty, and support in social and political conflicts. The creation of a bond friendship was not merely an expression of personal affection. It was the creation of a social alliance, recognized by the community and carrying real obligations and real consequences for those who violated its terms. The Kaskungsan of southern Africa, one of the most studied hunter-gatherer societies in the world, had an institution called Ngzaro, which involved the ritualized exchange of gifts between individuals who had formed a special bond of friendship and alliance. Ngzaro relationships created obligations of generosity and mutual support that extended across geographic distances, allowing individuals to access resources and assistance from people in other groups and other regions. In an environment where the availability of resources was highly variable, where the rains might fail in one region while another received adequate rainfall, this network of bond friendships was a crucial social technology for managing risk. It was, in effect, an insurance system built from the material of human relationship. The study of Gairo and similar institutions in other hunter-gatherer societies has been influential in the development of anthropological thinking about the social basis of human cooperation. It suggests that the social bonds that human beings form, including the bonds that we often think of as primarily emotional or personal, have always served important material and social functions as well. The emotional warmth of friendship and the practical utility of a social alliance are not, in this view, two separate things. They are aspects of a single reality. The human capacity to form bonds of trust and mutual obligation that make cooperation possible. This understanding has implications for how we think about the relationship between friendship and romantic partnership. In many contemporary accounts, the romantic partnership is presented as the more important and more serious bond, the one that involves real commitment and real stakes, while friendship is presented as a supplementary and ultimately more casual form of connection. But the historical and anthropological record suggest that this hierarchy is, to a significant degree, a modern cultural artifact rather than a reflection of the actual importance of friendship in human social life. Across much of human history and across many non-Western societies today, the bonds of same-sex friendship between adults have been primary social relationships. Relationships that involve deep emotional intimacy, strong practical obligations, and social recognition. The friendship between women in many traditional societies, the bonds formed in the shared work of food preparation, childcare, and domestic labour, were relationships of great emotional depth and practical importance. The women of a village or neighbourhood who shared the work of daily life knew each other in ways that were as intimate and as sustaining as any romantic bond. These relationships have been largely invisible in historical accounts that focus on the public sphere of politics and economics, but they were the connective tissue of social life in village communities around the world. Similarly, the bonds of male friendship in many traditional societies, bonds formed in the shared work of hunting, herding, farming, and warfare, were relationships of great depth and significance. The idea of the devoted male friend who would sacrifice his life for his companion, who knew his companion's heart better than anyone else, who could be trusted absolutely in the most extreme circumstances. This figure appears in the literary and mythological traditions of cultures around the world, from the friendship of Gilgamesh and Enkidu in the oldest written epic tradition we possess, to the friendship of Achilles and Patroclus in the Homeric epics, to the sworn brotherhoods of medieval Europe, to the traditions of devoted male friendship documented in the ethnographic literature of cultures on every continent. The depth of these friendships, and the degree to which they were recognized and valued by the societies in which they existed, has often made modern interpreters uncertain about how to categorize them. Were these friendships also romantic partnerships? Were they sexual relationships? Were they, in modern terminology, and gay relationships? The honest answer is that these are questions that the historical record often cannot answer, and that may be the wrong questions to ask. The categories that modern culture uses to sort human relationships, friend versus partner, romantic versus platonic, gay versus straight, are not universal categories that apply cleanly to all human bonds in all times and places. They are specific cultural constructs that reflect the particular ways in which modern culture has organized the domain of human relationship. What the historical record makes clear is that human beings have always been capable of forming bonds of extraordinary depth, intimacy, and devotion that do not fit neatly into any single modern category. The attempt to sort these historical bonds into modern taxonomies often distorts rather than illuminates what was actually happening in the lives of the people involved. What it is more useful to notice is the sheer variety of forms through which human beings have found ways to be deeply known and deeply connected to one another, and to appreciate that variety as a reflection of the remarkable richness of human social and emotional capacity. As the great anthropologist Clifford Geertz once observed, the human being is, above all, an animal suspended in webs of significance that it itself has spun. The webs of relationship and meaning that human beings have constructed across their long history are among the most complex and beautiful things that our species has produced. They are not less real than the material world of tools and food and shelter. They are in many ways more real, more central to what it means to be a human being, more determinative of whether a human life is experienced as good or as empty. We live inside those webs. We are made by them. And in the quiet of the late hour, when the analytical mind begins to soften, and the boundaries between the self and the larger story become less sharp, it is possible to feel the threads of connection that run through all of it, backward through the generations to the earliest fires, forward into whatever comes next, and outward in all directions to the billions of other people who are right now also navigating the beautiful and difficult terrain of human love. The breath deepens, the thoughts slow. The story of human relationship. 300,000 years of reaching and caring and building and losing and beginning again dissolve slowly into the darkness of sleep. It has been a long story. It is still being told. Sleep now, tomorrow it continues. And so does the quiet, extraordinary fact of being human, of being the kind of creature that can look back across 300,000 years and feel in that looking something like kinship with all the people who ever lived, something like gratitude for the inheritance they have left, something like wonder at the strange and persistent miracle of love finding its way through every kind of world that has ever existed, leaving its mark in bones and stories and the long memory of the species. That is the story. That has always been the story. And tonight, in the quiet, you are part of it.